everyone, how are you? I'm Ari Thurger, and today I'm going to talk about contemporary paganism in Hungary. I was finally able to make a pause and have a bit of vacations, so I decided to come and visit Hungary. To be more precise, Budapest. How unexpected. Instead of being out there enjoying myself, I'm here making a video for YouTube, of course. But I didn't want to waste this opportunity, obviously. It's not every day I get to visit other countries, and this seems a good opportunity to talk about the contemporary pagan reality in Hungary. So I do hope you enjoy this video. With the end of socialism in Hungary, within the religious sphere, a lot of things changed. This isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's not a bad thing either. What happened with Hungary is practically the same thing that happened to other countries all across Europe, when there was finally the possibility to explore other realities that before, due to a certain oppressive political regime, wasn't at all possible. In Hungary, religious and national identities started to emerge, especially in the post-communist context. And what happens is that there is a particular tendency that often happens in these contexts, the destruction of cultural traditions due to the introduction of neo-paganisms and the arrival of new religious ideas that have absolutely nothing to do with the history of the country. But on the other hand, at the same time, this awakens a genuine interest in the traditional paganism of the country. So, during the early 90s of the past century, and when I say past century, I'm talking about the 20th century. I know most of us think about the 19th century when speaking about the past century, but I'm afraid we are already in the 21st century for some time. That's right, my friends, we are getting older and we are relics from another time. Anyway, during the early 90s, pagan groups established themselves in Hungary. Among these emerging pagan communities, at first most were weaker groups, influenced by Western traditions, which seems to be immediately the first neo-paganism people come in contact with due to its vast popularity. There were also communities aiming to restore the ancient Hungarian paganism, and there were modern shamanic groups. Neo-shamanism, which is also a huge tendency, very much based on core shamanism. I have spoken about on the video about Sami neo-shamanism. So, this was the main panorama during the early 90s in Hungary. And there was an increasing interest in paganisms during the early 2000s, precisely when these smaller groups, communities and organizations started to develop and grow and create several events. Contemporary Hungarian paganism is quite countercultural, as in rejecting or opposing the dominant values and behavior of the Western society. That's perhaps one of the main characteristics. This is precisely due to the shift or the transition from one political reality to another. So modern paganism in Hungary, in its ideology, marks a defined contrast with the globalized cultural reality and with the Western-oriented political and cultural ideologies. Paganism in Hungary nowadays is also a symbolic expression of political and ideological resistance to the modern world itself, to capitalism, and a resistance to the Western-oriented cultural aspects. trying to avoid the same path of Western European countries, in terms of neo-paganisms, of course. Even though it started off by absorbing Wicca, core shamanism, and other Western tendencies, nowadays neo-paganism in Hungary is trying to avoid precisely that, a rejection of other religious views and political ideologies that often mix with neo-paganisms. However, the approach to paganism in Hungary ends up going precisely towards that, as we shall see further ahead, in certain aspects only. Because, for instance, in political terms, in Western Europe, there is a great tendency of paganism turning to right-wing radicalism, and Hungarian paganism doesn't seem to have that political tendency, precisely due to the rejection and opposition to the Western-oriented political and cultural ideologies. At the same time, in Hungary, there is a great opposition to views represented by scholars when dealing with the historical past of Hungary. There is a great emphasis in the belief that scholars distort the true Hungarian history. So there is a sort of fight between scholars and the history of Hungary they portray, with the pagans who express alternative theories of history and linguistics with the objective of strengthening cultural identity. And this last point might be the reason why in contemporary Hungarian paganism there is a strong tendency towards syncretism, mainly merging or incorporating local Christian and indigenous elements into one single cultural reality, which is exactly what happens, for instance, in many Hausa-through organizations of the US, for instance, trying to diminish the credibility of academic work and then being inclined towards syncretism, merging Christian ideologies with Germanic pagan ones. Mind that I'm not going to express what I think about this. On this video, I'm standing on a neutral position to merely state what is happening with Hungarian paganism. I'm here to express the contemporary pagan religious reality of Hungary and not to express any kind of criticism. Just expressing the facts. So, in Hungary, there is a strong integration or merging of traditional Christian elements with elements of Hungary's ancient religion, which is why Hungarian pagans have a certain easiness and flexibility to incorporate various religious and political ideologies. So, within Hungarian contemporary paganism, there is a wide variety of different views, and they are accepted and adopted quite easily, and there isn't great opposition actually. So paganism in Hungary almost seems like a political religion or a sort of cult which absorbs New Age elements. So it's not that different from Wicca after all, which is a neo-paganism that picks up various religious elements deemed to be pagan, mixing them in an explosive cocktail of suppositions, New Age ideologies, and unverifiable personal gnosis, creating a unique modern religious reality. But the great difference between Hungarian contemporary paganism and Wicca is that Hungarian paganism is highly political. So, as you might have guessed, Hungarian paganism is characterized as being highly diverse and fragmented, without a clear structure or strong foundations, so to speak, unlike Baltic and Slavic paganisms in other countries around Hungary. which are well defined in their organizational, ritual and ideological characteristics. Baltic and Slavic paganisms, especially in new formed countries such as Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and so on, have clear defined indigenous forms of paganism, while in Hungary, that scenario is very difficult to reach. There is no unified ideology that can be immediately identified in Hungary. There seems to be a strong desire to embrace paganism in Hungary, but at the same time, there is a general disorientation and not knowing where to start, and what is and what isn't the traditional Hungarian paganism of the past. And now that I have been exposed to this reality here in Hungary, I understand why a lot of subscribers of this channel who are from Hungary are always so eager to know more and somehow trying to find a path. Because Hungarian paganism at the moment is everything and nothing at the same time. Too many divergent ideas merging together that do not give a concrete foundation. And that creates an absolute sense of disorientation. Hungary is a relatively new country in Europe. There was always great divisions, the borders constantly changing. Between the two world wars, Hungary becomes an interwar economy. It becomes a Soviet republic during the first half of the 20th century. There were numerous revolutions, the post-war communist period, and in 1989 it's the end of communism in Hungary, and it finally becomes a country of its own, and in 2004 enters the EU. So before the 2000s, there was never a moment to truly reflect on the original past of Hungary, on the pre-Christian past. And after so many changes and influences, oppression, and not being able to have a concrete and fixed national identity, it's obviously hard to understand the cultural past. This is very much like what happened to the Sami in Lapland, as I have expressed on the video about Sami neo-shamanism. Precisely with the beginning of the 21st century, the Sami youths were able to reflect on their past once freedom of thought was allowed, and to seek one's roots. So, in Hungary, what was offered was an alternative conception of the origin of the Hungarian nation and the Hungarian language in a panorama of romantic nationalism, which obviously created a beautiful idea of a cultural heritage, but it isn't the actual historical truth. So when you embrace a certain idea, when the truth comes at your door, it's hard to let go of the previous romantic idea that gave a sense of security and pride. And obviously there will be a rejection of academic work that shows the truth, because it isn't as beautiful as the previous idea, because it's less romantic. This happened to many European countries which are relatively new. Many countries we have today in Europe are late 20th century formations. So it's still quite early for many countries to actually be aware of their historical past. This was exactly what happened in the 19th century Germany. Germany is a relatively new country as well. Throughout history, it has always been much divided without a clear distinction which historical past and cultural heritage they really belong to. The Holy Roman Empire was extensive with hundreds of cultural realities. And when the Holy Roman Empire starts to dissolve, Germany is divided into hundreds of states, each one with their unique laws and political ideologies, like little countries next to each other. At some point, there were more than 300 states, some of which were just a castle somewhere in the middle of a field, and right next to it, 3 more states, and each one with its own unique features. And during the early 20th century, with notions of creating a single empire, notions of romantic nationalisms gave way to a false, delightful cultural past that it's hard to get rid of because it sounds great. Hungary seems to suffer from the same, and it's very hard to accept the actual cultural past. In an attempt to create a cultural identity of their own, Hungary merges various political and religious realities of their history, and obviously that doesn't give a detailed and factual cultural past. These theories are quite common in Hungary, in an attempt to shift the Hungarian nation from its Central European reality and trying to place Hungary in a realm of historical events that didn't happen, creating a reinterpretation of world history, making interpretations of the historical reality in a way that fits into modern ideologies. And that ends up creating false ideas of a cultural past. It creates a cultural past that was never real. But this doesn't just happen in Hungary. This happens throughout Europe, in many other countries. This happens within many neo-pagan Germanic organizations. For instance, forcibly trying to promote a complete fantastical historical past recently created as justifications for unverifiable personal gnosis. So by no means, Hungary is not alone. Everyone is trying to rediscover their cultural past, but it gets hard when political propaganda spreads false notions that go completely against the historical reality. By diminishing the credibility of academic work, especially archaeological work that finds actual physical proof, no one will be able to know their actual historical past. Don't take this the wrong way. Much of the written historical sources of the past, especially medieval documentations, have a lot of falsehood. But archaeology is the detective department of history and finds the truth that many times goes against the historical sources. Archaeology gives a lot of answers and helps greatly in discovering and rediscovering the actual past. Well, it's hard to remain neutral in these conversations, I'm sorry. After the end of communism in Hungary, in 1990, Christian churches were unable to rebuild themselves and have the same importance they had during the communist regime. So their political and historical role would never be significant again in Hungary. So there was a sort of void in ideologies following the fall of communism. The ideological emptiness felt among Hungarians significantly increased the necessity to seek some kind of religious answer to this emptiness. So new religious movements grew considerably. At the same time, there was an increasing unemployment and general insecurity due to the economic and political crisis. So, in general, people felt the need to hold on to something. So, the popularity of non-traditional religious ideas increased. There was the necessity to seek out individual and collective identities, which is an absolutely normal social phenomenon in transition societies. there is always the sense of emptiness, and people will naturally seek some foundations to hold on to, something concrete that will define a people as a nation, something that will unite people under a new flag and give a purpose. It's to seek out security, turning to a new sense-giving source. So it was during this time that nationalist narratives appeared in the religious background, since the previous religious background completely failed after the end of communism. In other words, there was the need to have that sense that you belong somewhere, and from there you can proceed. So, specific historical events were purposely selected to represent the past, to give the answers required in both the field of religion and politics. Political ideologies in general that were completely crumbling after the end of the communist regime. The process of nationalization aimed to place this reconstructed history in a wider political and ideological context, and to create myths of origin which were able to justify for the post-socialist society its own existence. A new construction of national identity was created, a reconstruction of an imaginary past, a fictional history to fit into the new political and social realities surging from post-communist Hungary. So, just like in many Eastern European countries, in Hungary, paganism appears as a religious reconstruction of a continuous religious practice of the past with contemporary forms of paganism. In one, all in one, as if it has been like that since always. The sense of paganism in Hungary is that what is practiced and the ideologies in it are ancient and indigenous, which has been proved that it is not. And it's a contemporary reconstruction, with actually very few elements that are actually indigenous. And I repeat, this is happening all over Europe. This happens in my own country too. Notions of a pagan past that it isn't real or it's not indigenous to the country, but it's beautiful and romantic, so people prefer that version. This is a mixture of various social factors that led to this reality, like the religious, social and political examples I've previously said. So it's perfectly natural the way things are being conducted. Hungarian paganism relies on folkloric and historical research to create a religious reality and a base of belief and practice. But much of this folklore and historical research since the 17th century has had different interpretations and theories, and some are quite absurd and not plausible at all. Besides, much has been invented and reconstructed to fit into the social and political reality of the various political regimes Hungary was into. So, Hungarian paganism in great part resembles the revival and construction processes within Western paganism itself. The very thing Hungarian paganism is trying not to follow, but ends up like everybody else throughout Europe. Hungary is suffering from the exact same thing everybody else throughout Europe is suffering from. Also through Odinism, Wicca, Neo-Druidism, core shamanism, Germanic neo-paganism, Celtic reconstructionist paganism, and so on. It's all contemporary creations, very much influenced by the modern social, religious and political realities of Europe, instead of trying to be apolitical reconstructionisms based on archaeological evidences. But this is not entirely people's fault, because only now, precisely with the turn of the century, archaeology has had more influence and impact on neo-paganism. Archaeology is relatively new as a social human science, and quite recently it used to be done by amateurs only trying to seek treasures and what really stands out, to find justification for nationalism ideologies. Only in the last 50 years or so, archaeology really became a science and started to make interpretations of the past. So obviously, most neo-paganisms didn't even have something reliable to rely on. But now we do. So I believe paganism in Europe is about to change greatly, and we shall get closer to the truth and how things were religiously conducted, and to have real knowledge of the past. We must rely on archaeology, because lately it has been giving us both the answers we wanted and the answers we didn't even know we needed. What is happening in Hungary is happening virtually everywhere else throughout Europe. Some countries just go slower than others, but surprisingly it's Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia that are doing pretty good in reconstructing their cultural past, and also the countries that rely a lot on archaeology, and of course whose governments support archaeology and scientific research, obviously. Hungarians, don't be disheartened. I'm certain you are well aware that every week in this country several presentations and lectures are organized in clubs and cultural centers, and loads of information in websites in Hungarian. There are dozen festivals in Hungary connected to different branches of paganism. Several ancient Hungarian elements are appearing on clothing, and several brands promoting Hungarian pagan symbols and motifs. So it's growing considerably. Contemporary Hungarian paganism is a diverse phenomenon with many religious groups and drum circles. It's a great mixture, like a rebellious movement. It's a revolution in response to our modern society of materialism and consumerism. Indeed, Hungarian paganism is very counter-cultural, a strong rejection and opposition to the modern values and behaviors of our societies. You couldn't expect otherwise from a people who has always been in revolutions throughout history, trying to claim their freedom. Europe is standing right now on this same platform, in a religious and even spiritual revolution, trying to go back to our roots. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, talk pretty well.